Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1910, a government surveyor named Carlton Briggs ventured into a remote section of the Ozarks near Shannon County to map virgin timber for potential logging operations. Briggs was 34 years old, a veteran surveyor with 12 years of experience mapping wilderness territories across Missouri, Arkansas, and southern Illinois. His reputation within the General Land Office was exemplary, known for thorough documentation and reliable assessments of timber resources. On September 14, 1910, Briggs sent his last known correspondence to the General Land Office in Jefferson City, a detailed letter describing his progress and an unusual discovery. He wrote that while following established survey lines, he had encountered peculiar trail markings carved into tree bark throughout the region. These symbols appeared deliberately placed to guide travelers deeper into the forest, yet matched no known surveying marks, indigenous patterns, or historical trailblazes that Briggs had encountered in his extensive career. The markings consisted of geometric shapes, spirals, and stylized representations of human figures that seemed to be walking into the forest depths. Briggs expressed both curiosity and professional excitement about these symbols, speculating they might represent forgotten surveying efforts from early French exploration or possibly indigenous trail markers predating American settlement. He described his intention to follow these markings alone, confident in his wilderness experience and dismissive of warnings he had received from local residents. His letter concluded with enthusiastic notes about the exceptional quality of the old-growth forest he was documenting, mentioning massive oak and hickory specimens that would yield premium lumber and his excitement about completing the survey ahead of his projected schedule. Briggs anticipated returning to civilization by September 28th with comprehensive maps and timber assessments. When Briggs failed to report by his expected return date, initial concerns from the land office were minimal. Surveyors frequently extended their field time when conditions proved favorable or when interesting features warranted additional documentation. However, by mid-October, with no communication from Briggs for over a month, the land office grew sufficiently worried to contact Shannon County authorities and request a welfare check. The region Briggs had entered was known locally as Sanctuary Hollow, a 200-square-mile expanse of virgin timber that had somehow escaped the aggressive logging operations that had systematically cleared surrounding forests throughout the 19th century. Sanctuary Hollow occupies a geological depression in the Missouri Ozarks, where ancient forests have stood undisturbed for centuries, creating an ecosystem unlike any other in the region. The hollow spans approximately 200 square miles of old-growth timber, characterized by massive oak, hickory, and pine trees, some specimens exceeding 300 years in age and reaching heights of over 150 feet. The terrain consists of steep limestone bluffs, rising sharply from narrow valleys, creating a labyrinth of ridges and hollows that make navigation treacherous even for experienced woodsmen. The area is further complicated by extensive cave systems and limestone sinkholes that perforate the landscape, some dropping vertically for hundreds of feet, with openings concealed by dense undergrowth. Swift flowing streams cut through the valleys, their courses shifting with seasonal rains and creating unstable banks that collapse without warning. The forest canopy grows so dense in many areas that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor, creating permanent twilight conditions even at midday. What makes Sanctuary Hollow particularly unusual in the context of Ozark history is its mysterious preservation. Throughout the 19th century, as timber companies systematically cleared the Ozark forests to feed growing demand for lumber in expanding Midwestern cities, this specific region remained completely untouched. County land records from 1847 onward show multiple attempts by various timber interests to survey and purchase the hollow for logging operations, yet each effort ended in failure. Timber companies would send advance teams to assess the forest quality and determine optimal cutting strategies, only to have those teams return with reports of impassable terrain, unusual hazards, or resource quality that somehow failed to justify exploitation despite obvious evidence of valuable timber. In several documented cases, assessment teams simply vanished entirely, their disappearances attributed to wilderness accidents and eventually written off as operational losses. By 1890, Sanctuary Hollow had gained a firm reputation among timber interests as economically unfeasible despite the obvious and substantial value of its virgin timber stands. Companies that had successfully logged every other accessible forest in the region consistently refused to pursue operations in the hollow, citing vague concerns about difficult terrain and poor return on investment. Local folklore provided a starkly different explanation for why Sanctuary Hollow remained untouched by commercial logging. Settlers who arrived in the 1832s, establishing homesteads in the hills surrounding the hollow, encountered explicit warnings from earlier French trappers who had worked the region decades before. These French trappers called the area Le Bois qui marche, the woods that walk, a name that suggested something fundamentally wrong about the forest itself. The warnings passed from French trappers to American settlers were not merely superstitious tales but practical survival advice based on observed patterns of disappearance and disturbing encounters. The Holbrook Timber Company of Springfield, Missouri, represented the most ambitious and well-funded attempt to exploit Sanctuary Hollow's substantial timber resources. In March 1909, company president Marcus Holbrook, a successful lumber baron who had made his fortune clearing forests throughout southern Missouri, dispatched a team of 12 experienced woodsmen to conduct a comprehensive survey of the hollow and negotiate potential logging rights with local landowners. The expedition was led by James McKenna, a veteran foreman with 15 years of timber cruising experience across the Ozarks, Ouachitas, and Appalachian regions. McKenna had successfully assessed some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States and was known for his ability to evaluate timber stands accurately and identify optimal logging strategies. His team consisted of experienced surveyors, timber estimators, and woodsmen who collectively represented decades of frontier expertise. McKenna's expedition was equipped with the most modern surveying instruments available in 1909, including precision transits, measuring chains, and photographic equipment for documenting specimen trees. The team carried camping supplies sufficient for 6 weeks of field work and was provided with detailed maps based on earlier partial surveys of the hollow's periphery. Marcus Holbrook had given McKenna explicit instructions to produce comprehensive maps showing terrain features, timber densities, species distributions, and optimal locations for establishing logging camps and transportation routes. The expedition entered Sanctuary Hollow on March 28, 1909, and established a base camp near the hollow's southern edge. The team's initial reports, sent by courier to Holbrook's Springfield office at weekly intervals, expressed considerable enthusiasm about the forest's exceptional quality. McKenna wrote on April 2nd that the timber exceeded all expectations, describing massive oak specimens with diameters exceeding 6 feet and pristine pine stands that would yield premium lumber for construction markets. He estimated that the hollow contained enough valuable timber to supply Holbrook's mills for at least 5 years of continuous operation, representing a potential profit of hundreds of thousands of dollars. However, even these enthusiastic early communications contained details that should have raised concerns. McKenna described finding carved symbols on trees throughout the hollow, mysterious marks that appeared deliberately and systematically placed, yet matched no surveying notation system, trail-blazing convention, or indigenous marking tradition he had encountered in 15 years of wilderness work. The symbols consisted of geometric patterns, interlocking spirals, and what McKenna described as stylized human figures positioned as if walking into the forest depths. The carvings showed varying degrees of weathering, suggesting they had been created over an extended period, possibly spanning decades or even centuries. In spring 1910, following months of silence after the McKenna expedition's disappearance, Holbrook Timber Company organized a second expedition with the explicit purpose of locating the missing team and determining what had prevented their return. This rescue party consisted of 8 experienced men led by Samuel Morton, a veteran tracker and wilderness guide who had spent 20 years leading hunting parties through the most remote sections of the Ozarks. Morton was renowned for his ability to read trail signs, interpret disturbed vegetation, and follow tracks across terrain where others saw nothing. The company provided him with detailed maps based on McKenna's earlier reports and correspondence, marking the last known positions of the original team and their planned survey routes. Morton's expedition entered Sanctuary Hollow on April 20th, 1910, following the documented route McKenna's team had taken the previous year. The rescue party moved cautiously, aware of the original expedition's fate and alert for any signs of danger or unusual conditions. Within 3 days of entering the hollow, they located McKenna's first established camp, positioned at a natural clearing near a limestone spring. The scene they discovered was profoundly and inexplicably disturbing. The camp stood in perfect order, as if the occupants had simply paused their activities mid-task and walked away without concern for their equipment or supplies. Tents remained erected in precise military arrangement, their canvas intact and guy lines properly tensioned. Supplies were neatly organized under weather protection, including foodstuffs that had long since spoiled but remained in carefully arranged stacks. A meal sat half-prepared on the camp's cooking table. The food rotted beyond recognition, but the arrangement of utensils and ingredients suggesting the cooks had stopped work suddenly in the middle of food preparation. No signs of struggle, violence, or hasty departure marked the campsite. Equipment lay positioned exactly where it should be, according to standard logging camp organization. Personal belongings remained in individual tents, including valuable items like watches, money, and personal papers that men would never abandon voluntarily. The camp appeared as though 12 men had simultaneously stood, left their tasks incomplete, and walked into the forest without taking any provisions or equipment. Morton's team discovered multiple similar camps as they progressed deeper into the hollow, following the trail of McKenna's systematic survey. Each site showed the identical pattern of orderly abandonment, as if the team had established camp, worked normally for a period, then abruptly ceased all activity and departed without their belongings. Most disturbing were the personal journals recovered from these abandoned sites. Several McKenna team members had maintained detailed daily logs of their surveying work, professional documentation of timber assessments, terrain features, and progress toward mapping objectives. These journals ended mid-sentence, literally stopping in the middle of written words, as if the writer had paused to set down his pen for a momentary interruption and simply never returned to complete his thought. Among the fragmentary and often unreliable accounts of Sanctuary Hollow that emerged over the decades, one testimony stands uniquely credible due to the witness's character, consistency, and the professional documentation of her experience. Martha Hensley, a respected herb gatherer and folk healer from Eminence, Missouri, entered the hollow alone in October 1908 and emerged 3 days later in a state of severe psychological trauma. Her survival made her the only extensively documented person to enter Sanctuary Hollow completely solo and return capable of providing coherent testimony about her experience. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town physician and a Yale-educated medical professional who maintained meticulous patient records, documented Martha's account in detail on October 18, 1908, noting in his medical journal that she appeared physically unharmed but exhibited symptoms of profound psychological shock. Martha Hensley, then 42 years old, had spent more than 2 decades gathering medicinal plants throughout the Ozarks, supplying local doctors and folk healers with herbs, roots, bark, and fungi used in traditional remedies. She possessed extensive knowledge of forest ecology, could identify hundreds of plant species, and had navigated virtually every accessible section of Shannon, Carter, and Oregon counties during her professional work. Her reputation for reliability and practical-minded skepticism made her an unlikely candidate for believing or propagating superstitious tales. She had consistently dismissed local warnings about Sanctuary Hollow as backwards folklore that had no place in the modern era of 1908. On October 12, 1908, Martha entered the hollow alone, searching for a rare bracket fungus that grew exclusively on old-growth hardwoods and commanded premium prices from pharmaceutical suppliers in St. Louis. She knew the fungus required very specific conditions found only in undisturbed ancient forests, and Sanctuary Hollow's virgin timber represented ideal habitat. She planned to gather sufficient specimens during a day trip and return to Eminence by nightfall, a routine she had executed hundreds of times in various forest locations. According to her testimony recorded by Dr. Morrison, Martha followed a clearly marked game trail deeper into the hollow than she had originally intended, drawn forward by increasingly promising habitat for her target fungus. As afternoon shadows lengthened and the dense canopy reduced available light to twilight levels, she realized with growing concern that she had become disoriented. The trail she had carefully followed seemed to shift and change when she attempted to retrace her steps, appearing different from what she distinctly remembered passing. Landmarks she had mentally noted seemed to have moved or disappeared entirely. After an hour of increasingly frustrated attempts to backtrack, Martha made the practical decision to establish a temporary camp and wait for morning when improved light and a calm mind would make navigation easier. Dr. Samuel Morrison's professional interest in Sanctuary Hollow began as simple medical curiosity following Martha Hensley's disturbing testimony, but rapidly evolved into an obsession that would consume the final years of his life and produce the most comprehensive early documentation of the Hollow's phenomena. Morrison, who had relocated to the Ozarks in 1895 after completing his medical degree at Yale, possessed both the scientific training to approach anomalous phenomena methodically and the intellectual curiosity to pursue questions that other professionals might dismiss as unworthy of serious investigation. Martha Hensley's psychological state following her return from Sanctuary Hollow intrigued Morrison deeply. She exhibited symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, including persistent anxiety, difficulty sleeping, startled responses to sudden sounds, and what Morrison recognized as dissociative episodes where she seemed to mentally depart from present circumstances. Yet despite these symptoms, Martha maintained remarkable and troubling consistency in her account, even when Morrison interviewed her repeatedly over several weeks, varying his questions to test for confabulation or elaboration. Her testimony never wavered in essential details, suggesting she was reporting genuine experiences rather than constructed narratives. Morrison began systematically compiling historical records related to Sanctuary Hollow, recognizing that Martha's case might represent one instance of a larger pattern. He obtained missing persons reports from Shannon, Carter, and Oregon County Sheriff's offices, painstakingly reviewing decades of records to identify disappearances that occurred in proximity to the hollow. He cross-referenced these reports with land survey records, timber company correspondence, and newspaper accounts of unexplained vanishings. The pattern that emerged was statistically unmistakable and deeply disturbing. Solo travelers entering Sanctuary Hollow vanished at rates that far exceeded any reasonable expectation based on normal wilderness accident frequencies. Morrison's research uncovered indigenous legends and oral traditions that predated American settlement of the region by centuries. Through careful interviews with elderly Osage individuals, conducted with respect and recorded in detailed journals now housed at the Missouri Historical Society, Morrison documented consistent warnings about Sanctuary Hollow that had been transmitted through generations. The indigenous accounts spoke of first people, ancient inhabitants who had abandoned normal human existence to learn to live as the forest lives. These beings had developed ways of existing that merged their consciousness and physical forms with the woodland environment, becoming part of the forest ecosystem in ways that transcended conventional understanding of human biology. According to these traditions, the first people took lonely travelers not to harm them but to teach them the old ways, to show them how to abandon limiting human form and join the forest's collective existence. The Missouri state government's official decision to survey Sanctuary Hollow came directly from persistent pressure by timber industry representatives who were frustrated by decades of failed private expeditions and determined to exploit what remained one of the largest stands of virgin timber in the state. In July 1910, the General Land Office, responding to lobbying from multiple timber companies and encouraged by state legislators representing timber districts, assigned Carlton Briggs, a surveyor with 12 years of distinguished government service, to conduct a comprehensive mapping of the region and provide professional assessment of its timber resources and commercial viability. Briggs approached this assignment with the professional confidence of a man who had successfully surveyed some of Missouri's most challenging wilderness areas and the mild contempt of an educated professional for what he considered backward rural superstition. County records preserved in the Shannon County Archives show that local authorities made genuine attempts to dissuade Briggs from undertaking the survey, or at minimum, to convince him to approach it with appropriate caution. Shannon County Sheriff Daniel Yates met personally with Briggs on August 3, 1910, spending several hours presenting him with copies of Dr. Morrison's research documentation, accounts of previous disappearances, including the recent loss of the entire McKenna expedition, and sworn testimonies from survivors of encounters within the hollow. Sheriff Yates, who had served in law enforcement for 18 years and investigated multiple disappearances personally, strongly recommended that Briggs either decline the assignment or request additional personnel and support before entering Sanctuary Hollow. Briggs dismissed these concerns in a letter to his supervisor at the General Land Office, a communication preserved in federal archives that reveals his attitude toward local warnings. He wrote that he had no patience for ghost stories and superstitious nonsense, that his professional training and experience equipped him to handle any wilderness challenges the hollow might present, and that he intended to complete a thorough and professional survey that would finally dispel the ridiculous myths that had prevented rational exploitation of valuable public resources. However, despite his skepticism, Briggs demonstrated some practical caution by agreeing to hire local guides who possessed intimate familiarity with the hollow's terrain and could help him navigate efficiently. On August 10, 1910, accompanied by two experienced local woodsmen, Thomas Creek and James Holloway, both of whom had worked as hunting guides and timber scouts for decades, Briggs entered Sanctuary Hollow to begin his systematic survey. The expedition proceeded normally for the first week, with Briggs's detailed field notes later recovered from his final camp, documenting precise measurements of timber specimens, careful observations of terrain features, and methodical plotting of survey points that would form the basis for comprehensive maps. When Carlton Briggs failed to emerge from Sanctuary Hollow by his expected return date of September 10, 1910, and subsequent inquiries revealed that his hired guides Thomas Creek and James Holloway had returned weeks earlier, reporting that they had parted ways with Briggs on August 20th due to his insistence on surveying areas they refused to enter. Shannon County Sheriff Daniel Yates contacted the Wainwright brothers Thomas and Eugene, who were experienced local hunters with extensive knowledge of the hollow's border regions and reputations for tracking skills and wilderness competence. On September 5, 1910, after consulting maps based on Briggs's recovered preliminary survey notes and interviewing Creek and Holloway about the surveyor's last known position, and the Wainwright brothers entered Sanctuary Hollow following the documented route Briggs had taken. They carried supplies for 1 week, weapons for protection against potential wildlife threats, and explicit instructions from Sheriff Yates to maintain constant communication with each other and abandon the search immediately if they encountered any circumstances they judged threatening or unexplainable. The brothers located Briggs's final surveying position on September 7th after 2 days of careful tracking through increasingly difficult terrain. What they discovered at the site disturbed both men profoundly and would haunt Thomas Wainwright for the remainder of his life. Carlton Briggs's surveying equipment had been meticulously arranged in a precise, circular pattern around his final camp, creating a geometric design that served no practical surveying purpose. His expensive brass transit stood at the exact center of this arrangement, positioned as if for display rather than use. His measuring chains had been laid out in interlocking curves that formed complex geometric patterns when viewed from above. His field notebooks were stacked in a perfect pyramid beside the transit, their pages filled with measurements and observations, but showing no signs of distress or hasty abandonment. His personal belongings had been organized with unnatural orderliness, each item positioned with obvious care and intention as if arranged for inspection or inventory. No signs of violence, struggle, or hasty flight marked the campsite. Briggs's rifle remained propped carefully against a tree, fully loaded with its safety engaged, suggesting he had felt no immediate threat. His tent stood properly erected with all guy lines tensioned correctly. His food supplies were neatly stored in waterproof containers. Everything about the scene suggested calm, methodical organization rather than emergency or disaster. Most disturbing to the Wainwright brothers was the discovery of additional survey markers, identical to those Briggs used for establishing his mapping grid, leading away from the camp in multiple directions and creating a pattern that formed no logical surveying methodology that either brother could recognize despite their familiarity with standard survey practices. The mass search effort organized in October 1910 represented the largest coordinated official response to Sanctuary Hollow's disturbing pattern of disappearances and reflected growing public pressure for authorities to address what was increasingly viewed as an unacceptable threat to public safety. Shannon, Carter, and Oregon counties each contributed personnel, assembling an unprecedented search party of 37 men that included county sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, experienced deputies, and volunteer woodsmen with extensive wilderness experience. The search party was organized along quasi-military lines, with clear chain of command, established communication protocols, and explicit safety rules designed to prevent the disappearances that had plagued previous expeditions. The most fundamental rule, emphasized repeatedly during organizational meetings and enforced strictly during field operations, was that no searcher was to separate from the main group under any circumstances, regardless of what they saw, heard, or believed they needed to investigate. The organized search began on October 15, 1910, with the party entering Sanctuary Hollow in a coordinated formation that maintained visual contact between all members. Searchers moved systematically through the hollow, documenting everything they encountered and maintaining detailed logs of locations, observations, and discoveries. The expedition uncovered disturbing evidence scattered across multiple locations throughout the hollow, painting a picture of decades' worth of mysterious disappearances and abandoned camps. Search teams discovered camps dating from various historical periods, each showing the now familiar pattern of sudden abandonment without signs of violence or struggle. At one location deep within the hollow, searchers found equipment and supplies dating from the 1872 based on the style of tools and the dates stamped on preserved food tins. This camp's supplies were arranged in the same geometric patterns that had characterized more recent disappearances, suggesting that whatever phenomenon affected the hollow had been operating consistently for at least 40 years. Another site yielded the remains of what appeared to be a French trapper's shelter from the early 1800s, a rough structure built into a limestone overhang. Inside this shelter, searchers discovered French-language journals, their pages yellowed and brittle but still legible, describing encounters with forest dwellers who spoke in voices like wind through branches and who moved between trees in ways that seemed to defy normal human locomotion. The journals described these beings as wearing human shapes imperfectly, like clothing that did not quite fit properly. The search party's most significant and disturbing discovery occurred on October 18th when a team of deputies recovered Carlton Briggs's personal survey bag from a location more than 3 miles beyond his last documented surveying position. In 1911, Abigail Crown, a meticulous researcher employed by the Missouri Historical Society who had developed an interest in unexplained historical events and patterns of disappearance in frontier regions, compiled what remains the most comprehensive and statistically rigorous documentation of Sanctuary Hollow disappearances ever assembled. Crown's groundbreaking work, published as a detailed monograph titled The Hollow Vanishings and distributed to libraries, universities, and law enforcement agencies throughout Missouri, synthesized decades of county records, newspaper accounts from multiple publications, personal testimonies gathered through extensive interviews, and correspondence with families of missing individuals. Her research methodology was rigorous by the standards of early 20th century social science, involving systematic data collection, careful verification of sources, and statistical analysis that identified patterns invisible in individual cases but unmistakable when examined comprehensively. Crown's monograph identified 67 conclusively documented cases of individuals vanishing in Sanctuary Hollow between 1,834, when the first reliable county records began, and 1,910, when her research concluded. She noted that this number represented only cases with sufficient documentation to verify that disappearances had actually occurred in proximity to the hollow, and that the true number of vanishings was certainly higher, possibly substantially so, given the incomplete nature of 19th century record-keeping, the tendency of families to conduct private searches rather than involving authorities, and the general acceptance of wilderness deaths as unfortunate but unremarkable events on the frontier. Crown's most significant contribution was her systematic analysis of patterns in these disappearances, revealing statistical relationships that suggested the hollow's dangers were not random wilderness hazards, but followed specific rules that could be identified and potentially used to improve survival odds. Her research demonstrated that solo travelers entering Sanctuary Hollow faced a disappearance rate approaching 90%, a statistically extraordinary figure that could not be explained by normal wilderness accident frequencies, even accounting for the challenging terrain. Individuals traveling in pairs showed a dramatically reduced but still elevated disappearance rate of approximately 40%, with surviving partners consistently reporting that their companions had walked away following voices that called from the forest or pursuing figures glimpsed moving between trees. Most remarkably, groups of 3 or more people demonstrated a precipitous decrease in disappearances, with only 12% of such expeditions reporting missing members. The protective effect of group travel was statistically undeniable and suggested that whatever threat operated within the hollow specifically targeted isolation. Crown documented that even groups emerging intact from Sanctuary Hollow reported disturbing encounters that followed consistent patterns across decades and different witnesses. Crown's research methodology expanded beyond documentary analysis to include extensive interviews with indigenous peoples whose ancestral knowledge predated European contact and whose oral traditions preserved information that written records could not capture. Recognizing that Native American communities had inhabited the Ozarks for centuries before American settlement and would possess knowledge about Sanctuary Hollow that existed outside official documentation, Crown conducted systematic interviews with elderly Osage individuals whose ancestral territories had included the region surrounding the hollow. These interviews, conducted between 1911 and 1913, with the assistance of tribal translators who could bridge both language differences and cultural contexts, revealed consistent warnings and explanatory frameworks that had been transmitted through generations as essential survival knowledge. The Osage accounts, documented in Crown's field notes with careful attention to preserving original phrasings and concepts even when translation proved difficult, spoke extensively of beings they called the first people, entities who had inhabited the deep forests long before human memory extended. According to these carefully preserved oral traditions, the first people had originally been human in the conventional sense, but had made a collective decision in the distant past to abandon human ways of living and learn instead to exist as the forest exists. The nature of this transformation was described in terms that Crown found difficult to capture in English, involving concepts of consciousness, physical form, and relationship with the natural world that seemed to exist outside Western categorical frameworks. The first people had learned to draw sustenance directly from the forest ecosystem rather than through hunting or gathering, had developed ways of moving through the woodland that transcended normal human locomotion, and had achieved a form of existence where the boundary between individual consciousness and collective forest awareness became permeable or dissolved entirely. These beings, the Osage elders emphasized, were not malevolent spirits or supernatural entities, but rather represented an alternative form of human existence, one that most people would find incomprehensible or terrifying, but that possessed its own logic and purpose. The first people did not hunt or kill travelers who entered their domain. Instead, they watched, evaluated, and occasionally selected certain individuals who demonstrated readiness or suitability for transformation. Those selected were not harmed, but rather taught the old ways, guided through a process of fundamental change that would allow them to abandon limiting human form and join the forest's collective existence. The transformation was described as irreversible and complete. Once an individual began learning the old ways and accepting the changes they required, return to conventional human existence became impossible. The process rewrote their fundamental nature, altering consciousness, physical form, and basic drives until they became part of the Hollows community, forever separate from the human world they had left. In 1952, more than 40 years after the disturbing events of 1910, and long after public attention had shifted away from Sanctuary Hollow, the discovery of a cache of photographic materials in an abandoned cabin provided visual documentation that challenged rational explanation and reignited investigation into the Hollows phenomena. The cabin, a deteriorating structure located near Sanctuary Hollow's eastern border, had belonged to Harold Sykes, a reclusive amateur photographer who had died in 1948, leaving no known heirs, and whose property had remained untouched until county officials conducted an estate inventory. Inside a carefully sealed storage room, investigators discovered dozens of glass plate negatives stored in airtight metal containers that had protected them from moisture and deterioration. When these plates were developed by archivists at the Missouri State Historical Society using techniques appropriate for early 20th century photographic materials, the resulting images revealed scenes that seemed to document impossible perspectives and disturbing phenomena within Sanctuary Hollow. The photographs, which could be approximately dated to between 1908 and 1910, based on analysis of clothing styles, equipment types visible in images, and seasonal vegetation patterns, showed various search parties and individual explorers within the Hollow's depths. What made these images profoundly disturbing was not their subjects, but their perspective and what they implied about the photographer's position. Many photographs depicted subjects from dramatically elevated angles, as if the camera operator had been positioned 30, 40, or even 50 feet above ground level in the forest canopy. Given the substantial weight and fragility of early 20th century camera equipment, particularly the large format cameras required to produce the glass plate negatives Sykes had used, achieving such elevated positions seemed practically impossible. Large format cameras of that era weighed 30 to 40 pounds with their associated tripods and plate holders, making tree climbing while carrying photographic equipment extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Yet the images clearly showed downward angles that could only have been achieved from canopy-level positions. Several photographs in the collection depicted individuals who had been documented as disappearing in the hollow during the 1908 to 1910 period, images that appeared to have been taken years after these individuals' official vanishings, based on analysis of seasonal markers, vegetation growth patterns, and other contextual clues. These photographs showed missing persons walking through the forest, their clothing unchanged despite obvious passage of time, their physical appearance unaged, but somehow subtly wrong, in ways that multiple photo analysts independently identified, using nearly identical descriptive language. Professional photo analysts consulted by the Historical Society noted that subjects in these images moved with gaits that appeared biomechanically unusual, their postures and joint angles suggesting articulation patterns that differed from normal human locomotion. Throughout the 20th century, various scientific and academic institutions, motivated by intellectual curiosity, professional ambition, or simple refusal to accept that a phenomenon could resist rational investigation, attempted to study Sanctuary Hollow's disturbing phenomena through carefully controlled expeditions designed to gather empirical data while minimizing risks. Each of these attempts, despite increasingly sophisticated protocols and modern equipment, ended in failure and often tragedy, adding to the Hollow's documented history while providing no satisfying explanations. The most notable and well-documented attempt occurred in 1967 when the University of Missouri's Department of Anthropology organized an expedition explicitly designed to investigate Sanctuary Hollow's cultural history and document any indigenous or historical settlements that might exist within its boundaries. The expedition was led by Professor David Marshall, a tenured anthropologist with 15 years of field research experience in remote locations, and included two promising graduate students, Sarah Chen and Michael Torres, both of whom had completed extensive fieldwork in challenging environments. Marshall established strict safety protocols specifically designed to prevent the disappearances that had plagued earlier expeditions. All team members wore connected safety lines made of mountaineering-grade rope, creating a physical link that would prevent anyone from wandering away unnoticed. The team maintained continuous radio communication with a base station established at the Hollow's edge, with scheduled check-ins every 30 minutes. No individual was permitted to move beyond direct visual contact with at least one other team member under any circumstances. These protocols represented the most comprehensive safety measures ever implemented for a Sanctuary Hollow expedition. Despite these elaborate precautions, the expedition lost both graduate students on its third day of fieldwork in circumstances that suggested the Hollow's influence operated through mechanisms that physical restraints could not prevent. According to Professor Marshall's detailed incident report, filed with university administration and subsequently with local law enforcement, the loss occurred at approximately 2 in the afternoon on a clear day with excellent visibility. The team was conducting systematic photographic documentation of tree carvings they had discovered in a dense section of old-growth forest. Without warning or preceding discussion, both Chen and Torres simultaneously claimed to hear Professor Marshall calling urgently from different directions, despite the fact that Marshall was standing directly beside them and had not spoken. Before Marshall could respond to their claims or physically restrain them, both students disconnected their safety lines with rapid, efficient movements and walked purposefully into the forest in opposite directions, moving with unusual speed and coordination. In 1994, Park Ranger Paul Turner provided video testimony that became central to modern understanding of Sanctuary Hollow and represented the most detailed first-hand account of the Hollow's interior from a trained observer with no prior beliefs about the phenomena. Turner, then 42 years old with 15 years of professional ranger service and extensive wilderness experience, entered Sanctuary Hollow with his partner David Reston in May 1994 to investigate reports of illegal camping that had been received from hikers near the restricted zone's boundary. The Rangers followed standard protocols for entering potentially hazardous areas, maintaining continuous radio contact with their district station and adhering to strict buddy system requirements that mandated constant visual contact between partners. On their second day within the Hollow, while investigating what appeared to be a campfire smoke rising from a valley approximately half a mile from their position, Turner and Reston became separated when pursuing what they both initially believed were campers moving quickly through dense undergrowth ahead of them. The separation occurred despite their training and intentions, with Turner later describing a disorienting period where the forest seemed to shift around him and his partner's voice, which he could hear clearly calling from multiple directions, led him in circles until he found himself completely alone, with no idea which direction would lead back to their last confirmed position together. Turner spent 3 days alone in Sanctuary Hollow, an ordeal that would have been merely uncomfortable for an experienced wilderness professional under normal circumstances, but became profoundly disturbing due to what he encountered during his isolation. He emerged on May 24, 1994, on a state highway approximately 15 miles from his entry point, in a state of severe psychological distress that prompted immediate psychiatric evaluation and eventual institutionalization. His video testimony, recorded at a psychiatric facility where he remained under observation for 6 months, provided unprecedented detail about the hollow's interior and the beings that inhabit it. Turner described discovering a village or settlement of structures that appeared to grow directly from living trees rather than being constructed within the forest using conventional building methods. The architecture defied his understanding of structural engineering, with walls that curved organically following the growth patterns of massive oak and hickory trees, doorways that seemed to shift size depending on viewing angle, and interior spaces that appeared larger than the external dimensions of structures should permit. The buildings incorporated living wood seamlessly with what might have been shaped or guided growth, creating forms that blended so completely with the forest that they became nearly invisible from certain angles, but obvious from others. Scientific attempts to explain Sanctuary Hollow's well-documented phenomena have produced multiple competing theories over the decades, each addressing some aspects of the evidence while struggling to account for others, none achieving consensus acceptance among researchers who have studied the case comprehensively. The most conventional and widely accepted explanation among mainstream scientists attributes the disappearances to a combination of natural hazards and psychological factors operating in an environment that creates unusual challenges for all-wage human perception and navigation. Proponents of this theory argue that Sanctuary Hollow's terrain, which includes extensive cave systems, numerous limestone sinkholes with concealed openings, steep bluffs prone to rockfall, and dense vegetation that severely limits visibility, creates exceptional opportunities for fatal accidents that leave no easily discovered evidence. They suggest that survivors' disturbing accounts of non-human entities and impossible architecture result from trauma-induced hallucinations, sensory distortions caused by isolation and stress, and the human brain's well-documented tendency to create coherent narrative explanations for ambiguous or fragmentary sensory information. This explanation has the advantage of requiring no assumptions beyond established science and known psychological phenomena. However, critics point out that it struggles to explain the highly specific pattern where solo travelers face dramatically elevated disappearance rates while groups show statistical protection, a pattern that natural hazards and individual psychology cannot easily account for. Dr. Helen Walsh, a neuroscientist and environmental psychologist who became fascinated with Sanctuary Hollow following her professional involvement with Paul Turner's psychiatric evaluation, proposed a more unconventional but scientifically grounded hypothesis in her controversial 2003 paper published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. Walsh suggested that certain old-growth forest ecosystems, particularly those that have remained undisturbed for centuries like Sanctuary Hollow, might generate localized electromagnetic fields or release complex mixtures of volatile organic compounds that profoundly affect human consciousness in ways that current neuroscience is only beginning to understand. She theorized that Sanctuary Hollow's unique ecosystem, preserved without significant human interference for potentially thousands of years, could produce environmental factors that induce altered states of consciousness, particularly in isolated individuals who lack the social anchoring and reality checking that companions provide. Walsh's hypothesis drew on emerging research showing that certain electromagnetic frequencies can affect human temporal perception, spatial orientation, and even visual processing, combined with botanical studies demonstrating that some plant compounds, when absorbed through respiration, can alter brain chemistry in subtle but significant ways. She proposed that solo travelers, lacking the constant social interaction that helps maintain consensus reality and normal perceptual frameworks, might experience profound alterations in consciousness that manifest subjectively as encounters with non-human entities, impossible architecture, and temporal distortions. Groups would be partially protected because continuous social interaction maintains shared perceptual frameworks and provides constant reality checking that helps individuals resist or recover from environmentally induced altered states. Walsh's theory explained many reported phenomena, including the protective effect of group travel, the consistency of hallucinated encounters across different witnesses, suggesting common neurological responses to similar environmental triggers, and the absence of physical evidence for the entities and structures survivors describe. However, her hypothesis struggled to account for physical evidence, such as the recovered photographs showing missing individuals years after their disappearances, the systematically arranged equipment found at abandoned camps, and the consistent reports of voices that accurately mimic known individuals. More radical theories proposed by researchers willing to consider possibilities outside mainstream scientific frameworks suggested genuine, non-human intelligence inhabiting Sanctuary Hollow. Some researchers theorized about an isolated human population that had developed through centuries of genetic drift and cultural evolution in complete isolation, potentially developing extreme abilities for camouflage, mimicry, or environmental integration that would seem impossible but might represent unknown evolutionary adaptations. Others proposed theories involving quantum consciousness effects, where the forest ecosystem itself had somehow developed rudimentary collective awareness through incompletely understood quantum processes operating across billions of interconnected neurons in fungal networks, root systems, and other biological substrates. The most disturbing and least scientifically respectable hypothesis came from Dr. Richard Ames, a physicist who had studied reports of Sanctuary Hollow phenomena extensively before his academic career ended amid controversy over his increasingly unconventional theories. Compilation of survivor testimonies, recovered documents, and investigative reports across more than a century reveals consistent warnings about Sanctuary Hollow that transcend specific incidents, historical periods, and cultural backgrounds, suggesting that these warnings represent genuine protective knowledge rather than superstitious folklore. The most fundamental and universally repeated warning, appearing in indigenous oral traditions, French trapper journals, American settler accounts, and modern testimonies with remarkable consistency in phrasing despite vast differences in time and culture, is the simple imperative: never go alone into Sanctuary Hollow. This warning is not presented as superstitious caution, but as practical survival advice based on observable patterns where solo travelers vanish with statistical certainty while groups demonstrate measurable protection. The warning appears in documents dating back to the earliest French exploration of the region in the 1700s, suggesting that whatever danger the Hollow presents has operated consistently for at least 3 centuries and possibly far longer, based on indigenous accounts that reference much deeper historical timelines. The second consistent theme emerging from compiled testimonies describes Sanctuary Hollow not as a passive location where dangers might be encountered, but as an active entity that chooses certain individuals according to criteria that survivors cannot fully articulate but consistently attempt to describe. Multiple witnesses across different time periods report sensing that the forest itself actively evaluates visitors, observing them with patient attention and assessing their suitability for purposes that remain unclear but seem related to transformation or incorporation into the Hollow's mysterious population. Those who travel in groups appear protected not simply by numerical advantage or mutual assistance in navigating hazards, but by their social bonds themselves, and which seem to create some form of resistance to whatever force or influence operates within the Hollow. Individuals who enter alone lack this protective factor and become vulnerable to the Hollow's influence in ways that groups somehow resist. Survivors describe this vulnerability in terms of openness or receptivity, as if isolation removes psychological barriers that social connection maintains. Multiple accounts describe the Hollow and its inhabitants as patient and purposeful, rather than aggressive or opportunistically predatory. The beings within Sanctuary Hollow do not hunt or pursue visitors in the manner of predators seeking prey. Instead, they wait and observe with inhuman patience, watching travelers move through the forest and apparently assessing them according to unknown criteria before acting. This patience suggests intelligence and intentionality operating according to purposes that remain incomprehensible to human observers. The Hollow does not simply trap random victims, but appears to select specific individuals based on characteristics that survivors struggle to identify, but often describe in terms of readiness, suitability, or some quality of consciousness that makes certain people appropriate candidates for whatever transformation the Hollow offers. Fundamental questions about Sanctuary Hollow remain stubbornly unanswered despite more than a century of documentation, investigation, and analysis by researchers ranging from frontier sheriffs to modern scientists. The fate of the vanished constitutes perhaps the most pressing and disturbing of these unresolved mysteries. In over 100 documented disappearances, physical remains have never been recovered in any case where investigators had clear information about where someone was last seen. This complete absence of bodies suggests either extraordinarily effective concealment of evidence, or alternatively, that the missing have not died in conventional terms, but have instead undergone some form of transformation or translation to a state that leaves no conventional remains. Survivor accounts describing transformed individuals, people they recognized from missing persons reports, encountered years or decades after disappearances and appearing unchanged but fundamentally wrong in their movements and behaviors, offer the most disturbing explanation. If these accounts represent accurate observations rather than hallucinations or misidentifications, they suggest that the missing continue to exist within Sanctuary Hollow in states that transcend or fundamentally alter conventional human biology. The true nature of what inhabits Sanctuary Hollow resists clear definition despite consistent descriptions across centuries of testimony. Witnesses describe entities that appear human in general form and can apparently mimic specific human individuals with remarkable accuracy, yet operate according to physical and psychological principles that differ fundamentally from normal human function. Are these beings human in origin, people who have undergone profound transformation through processes unknown to conventional biology? Or do they represent something else entirely, entities that mimic human form without possessing human substance, perhaps using appearance as camouflage or communication strategy? The consistency of descriptions across vastly different historical periods and cultural contexts suggests these beings represent a stable population rather than isolated phenomena or individual anomalies, yet their nature remains fundamentally alien to human understanding. Multiple witnesses describe them as moving wrongly, speaking in voices that sound almost but not quite human, and watching with patient attention that suggests intelligence but not human consciousness. Why solo travelers face such specific and dramatic targeting, while groups demonstrate statistical protection, presents another unresolved question that any complete theory of Sanctuary Hollow must address. The protective effect of group travel is too consistent and too dramatic to represent coincidence or sampling error. Some researchers propose that human consciousness requires continuous social interaction to maintain coherent individual identity and stable perceptual frameworks, and that removing this social anchoring through isolation allows external influences to reshape awareness and alter fundamental aspects of consciousness. Sanctuary Hollow exists today as an officially designated restricted zone encompassing approximately 200 square miles of Missouri Ozark's old-growth forest, an area that remains legally closed to public access under state and federal regulations that cite unspecified environmental hazards and ongoing research requiring isolation from human interference. The restriction has been continuously enforced since 1985, when the most recent attempt at comprehensive study ended with the disappearance of 2 researchers, leading to a policy decision that the area presents dangers that cannot be adequately mitigated through any currently available safety protocols. The hollow is surrounded by warning signage that provides no specific information about the nature of dangers within, but emphasizes that entry is prohibited and that violators will face prosecution. The borders are monitored through periodic ranger patrols that follow established routes along the hollow's periphery but do not enter the restricted zone itself. Despite official restrictions and explicit warnings, unauthorized entries occur with disturbing regularity, typically by individuals who dismiss official warnings as bureaucratic overreach, who seek to prove their courage or independence by defying restrictions, or who are drawn by curiosity about the hollow's mysterious reputation. These trespassers rarely return. Statistical analysis of missing persons reports from counties surrounding the hollow shows that between 3 and 7 individuals per year disappear in circumstances consistent with entering the restricted zone, a rate that has remained remarkably consistent across the 4 decades since restrictions were implemented. Those few who do emerge from unauthorized entries exhibit the same constellation of psychological symptoms that have been documented in survivors throughout the hollow's history, including severe anxiety that persists for years, pathological aversion to solitude requiring constant human companionship to maintain psychological stability, and persistent sensations of being watched from within their own consciousness, as if something from the hollow has taken permanent residence in their awareness. Rangers assigned to patrol Sanctuary Hollow's borders, a duty that typically rotates among district personnel due to the psychological stress associated with extended proximity to the restricted zone, report ongoing anomalous activity that continues to this day. Monthly patrol logs, maintained as official records by the Missouri Department of Conservation, document consistent observations of distant voices calling from deep within the hollow, sounds that rangers describe as almost but not quite human, and that often mimic the voices of patrol partners or known individuals. Rangers report sounds of movement through forest undergrowth too dense for easy human passage, suggesting either beings that can navigate terrain that would stop normal humans, or perhaps movement through the forest canopy above ground level. Multiple patrol reports describe occasional glimpses of figures moving between trees at distances too great for detailed observation, but close enough that rangers can discern disturbing characteristics in their gait and posture, movements that veteran rangers with decades of wilderness experience describe as fundamentally wrong in ways they struggle to articulate precisely. The eternal vigil continues.